Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 29th of October 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. I've got Mike Robinson in the studio with me, firmly behind the technical desk. We're going to be joined by live video link by Justin Walker from the British Constitution Group. And well, the weather in Plymouth, not too good. Rainy, drizzly overnight. Not raining at the moment, but a bit gloomy. Apparently, it's pretty gloomy in London at the moment. The word dinge has been used, so not looking too good there. And Brighton is anything but bright because we've got rain and overcast, drizzle in fact. So looking a bit gloomy as far as the weather front is concerned. And of course, things continue to go from bad to worse on the British political scene. Well, we thought we'd start today with the demonstrations that took place yesterday in London for Royal Marine Sergeant Alexander Blackman. This is the Royal Marine who is in prison at the moment for 8 years for killing a Taliban on the battlefield. And many people deeply unhappy at his conviction in what they describe as a flawed trial. I thought it was very interesting that Russia today put up some really excellent video clips showing the number of people present. The Mail here saying that there were 1,000 people in Parliament Square and another 500 actually walked to Downing Street when a petition was handed in. But basically, BBC simply reported there was a demonstration. So lots of pictures in the Daily Mail. Encourage you to have a look at the article. The lady here circled is Claire, Sergeant Alexander Blackman's wife. She was obviously speaking out and later went to Downing Street. And this is one of the key things about the incarceration of this man. Colonel Oliver Lee said Sergeant Blackman's investigation, court-martial and sentencing authority remain unaware to this day of the wider context within which he was being commanded when he acted as he did. My attempts to bring proper transparency to this process were denied by the chain of command. Sergeant Blackman was therefore sentenced by an authority blind to facts that offered serious mitigation. Well, of course, what many people were saying in that London demonstration was simply that Sergeant Blackman was completely stitched up by the British government, having been put into the battlefield repeatedly and together with other units of the Royal Marines failed in the support that the British government under the government gave. We end up with a tragic killing. So I'd just like to have a look at it from this angle, which is a fairly simple one. Sergeant Blackman in prison at the moment. His crime was killing a wounded Taliban on the battlefield. This man, of course, remains totally free. Tony Blair, the man responsible ultimately for all the deaths and mutilation in an unlawful war in Afghanistan, walking scot-free with not a single charge coming against him. This is the gross hypocrisy of Britain under both, of course, Labour, Conservative and Lib Dems. And I also would like just to remind people of the hypocrisy of Judge Jeff Blackett. So this is the desk officer, a man who, well, he's military, but we could argue that point because he's also working as a magistrate. He sits as judge in the Blackman case, but of course he's also involved with Help for Heroes. So the judge that ran a flawed trial put Sergeant Alexander Blackman in prison for murder. Tony Blair, of course, the man ultimately responsible, stays free. And if we may, Mike, just pop that one back on. Here we are. I just wanted to say, let us also remember the Taliban who died on the battlefield because I put him under Tony Blair there. Of course, if Tony Blair had not created an unlawful war, maybe that gentleman would still be alive and Sergeant Blackman would still be a free man. Justin, you're ex-military yourself. What's your thought on this incarceration?
He was in my father was in the Marine Commandos just after the war in 42 Commando, which I think is his commando. I'm just appalled by the whole thing. The people who sentenced him have never experienced a battlefield. I haven't experienced a battlefield, so I wouldn't even begin to know what he and his team went through. Appalling situation they found themselves in. I believe the atrocities being committed by the Taliban at the time, and still do, were appalling. Certainly, they don't abide by the Geneva Convention. And I think to give this man the sentence they did is it's just unbelievable. So I give my 100% backing to getting Sergeant Blackman out, and there shouldn't even be a stain on his record. As far as I'm concerned, he's a hero.
Well, thank you for that. I think one of the things that was missing from that demonstration were, of course, banners with the faces of David Cameron and Tony Blair, because ultimately people are responsible for what's happened. Getting Sergeant Blackman out is the key priority. But of course, the people who took this country into an unlawful war and wars that have taken place after Afghanistan, of course, Libya, we've got Syria now going on. Surely they should also be brought to trial and convicted and imprisoned where appropriate. Well, of course, nothing is now sacred on the battlefield. And Mike, you've got a report on this business of hospitals now being bombed. Fair game, collateral damage, apparently.
Well, so it seems. So we mentioned this yesterday. The Saudis have now accepted that this happened, but they blame Médecins Sans Frontières for giving the Saudi-led coalition, quotes, the wrong coordinates for the hospital. And of course, this explanation, as you would imagine, has not been accepted by MSF or any of the other groups on the ground. So MSF said, this is Hassan Bousanin, the head of MSF in Yemen, said the attack is another illustration of a complete disregard for civilians in Yemen, where bombings have become a daily routine. Now, it's interesting because Syria is alleging that Turkey and Saudi Arabia have been transporting ISIS militants to Yemen from Syria to get them away from the Russian bombings and in order to get them fighting in Yemen. So what seems to be the case here is that this Saudi operation in Yemen is an effort to effectively give ISIS another base of operations.
We couldn't make it up.
No.
I've got to add to that bit because as you follow the evidence trail, the evidence trail is now public. It is available on the internet for us as we follow it through. And you've also got an escalation in Iraq and Syria.
Well, this is an opinion piece by the New York Times, quite interesting. They are saying that basically the Obama administration is taking steps to expand its military campaign. We've mentioned this yesterday as well, but I just wanted to highlight what they said here, because they said the Pentagon continues to call the military campaign in Syria and Iraq an advise and assist mission, a characterization that is misleading when the campaign began and is now absurd. By incrementally increasing its combat role in a vast, complicated battleground, the United States is being sucked into a new Middle East war. With a few exceptions, lawmakers seem completely unconcerned that they are allowing a president to go to war without formal authorization from Congress. Taking on Mr. Assad, a murderous leader who has lost all legitimacy, is an obvious appeal in principle, but doing so would almost certainly be catastrophic, because it would lead the US directly to war with Russia and Iran. And of course, that is really what we're seeing, this continuing building rhetoric. In fact, if you look back through the historical situation, this rhetoric has been building since before the South Ossetian War in Georgia in 2008. And it's been a pretty consistent propaganda campaign since then. So this really isn't going to bring the US into a Middle East war. The Middle East war is merely a step along the way. But the hint about the broader sort of theater of war here comes from this: the Pentagon giving $55 billion to Northrop Grumman, for the construction of 100 new stealth bombers. They're due to enter service by 2025, and they're going to replace the B-52 and B-1 bombers. Now, the details of these aren't available yet. They're going to be called Long Range Strike Bomber, LRSB. It remains classified. And I suppose you could say we hope that Northrop Grumman does a better job than Lockheed Martin have done with the F-35, perhaps. But we'll wait and see if these ever appear. But $550 million each. So there you go. This Northrop Grumman gets the deal.
Yes, Justin. Any comments from you?
Well, I would just say the whole situation in the Middle East, I think, can be put down to what is termed the Greater Israel Project, which clearly has the roots, the Zionists. I think that if we're not careful, the Middle East could become like the Balkans were to the First World War. We could see World War III triggered. It's quite possible. No, I just wish people would look at the real truth, the real background to the Middle East. And of course, if you do that, the money creators, the banks, the central banking system is there. And so we need to look at the bigger, much, much bigger picture to know why this is all happening.
Absolutely.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you for that. Well, of course, one of the things that we've been pointing out is that we've got this conundrum at the moment. We have David Cameron, who's constantly standing on the world stage and ramping up the rhetoric that President Putin and those nasty Russians want to create World War III. They want to take over the Middle East. They're taking over Syria. But while David Cameron does this, he has been cutting and cutting British armed forces to a point where effectively they're no longer viable for any sustained campaign to defend Britain as a nation state. Many people don't see this, some are just confused by it, but the real clue to it is what's going on in the background. So I'd like to just bring in these images, which has come from a video on YouTube. It's called Pirates Mess with the Wrong Navy. And what's in this little video? Who's put it together? Not quite clear, because the source Eurosong 99 has got a lot of very pro-European Union video clips. But this one is very useful because it gives us an idea of what's going on. So the video is all about how the European armed forces are dealing with pirates. And through the video clip, we get some very interesting shots of the EU military as they are being created. I got a very uneasy feeling from this sort of shoulder band that this man is wearing. To me, it just sort of leapt out as a relic of the Nazi Party, but maybe I'm wrong. Here we are. We've got all sorts of troops lined up, and central there, flapping in the breeze, is the European Union flag. And then here we are, where we now have a variety of navies, including the Royal Navy, operating under the European Union flag. And where does this take us? Well, I just took this from another one of the Eurosong 99 video clips, because this is a promotional video for the fact that the European Union is going to create its own stealth bomber. So that ties in very nicely with what you've just reported, Mike. But we've got the situation, British armed forces cut to the bone. What is David Cameron really doing? Well, of course, he's working hand in glove with the European Union to create a full spectrum of EU armed forces, Army, Navy and Air Force. And Justin, I'm going to pass back to you on that one, because this is really obvious once you put some of the pieces together on the table.
Do you know something? I just had a thought. I wonder how long it is before we see fluttering from the stern of a warship, instead of the white ensign, we're going to see the blue flag with the gold stars. I just wonder how long it's going to be before one of our ships is told basically to put up the European flag because it's taking part in a European operation.
Well, I think this is already happening. I will double check that. I think it is already happening, not replacing the white ensign, but certainly European flags being flown. And this stuff is coming in incredibly quickly. So David Cameron lying to the British nation that he's really trying to hold back from the European Union. But after the 2010 Strategic Defence Review, it was David Cameron that set up this joint collaboration with the French to effectively amalgamate French and British armed forces. That was the soft, thin end of the wedge in order to get in the European forces. And if we jump across to this one, we did mention this yesterday, but I'm bringing in again. We've got CNN here absolutely ramping up the rhetoric against those nasty Russians. The Russian submarine patrols and special operations are going near all the vital underseas communication cables. So in this clip, here was a picture of those cables to show the density, the intensity of them under the sea. And one expert says, well, we can forget the cloud, the web cloud. This is where the data is really concentrated in undersea cables. Then it goes on to show those nasty Russian vessels with their submersibles who've been lurking near vital data cables. And it says, here we are, sabotage on the cable. And then they get very excited because a solitary Russian vessel has passed near to the east coast of the States on its way down to Cuba. So as I said yesterday, and I'll repeat it, this is standard stuff. This has been going on for years and years and years since the Cold War days. All of a sudden it's being brought to the fore and we're to be terrified because it's warlike action by the Russians. Complete nonsense. Remember, of course, again, that while this rhetoric is pushed forward, David Cameron cutting the Royal Navy to the bone, and we've reported over the last couple of days that we believe Plymouth MP Oliver Colville has been tasked to conduct a review of Britain's submarine industry with a view to scrapping it. We'll wait for further information on that. So surprising that as we can snoop on the world, we don't quite know what the Russians are doing. We don't know what ISIS is doing. Do we know what the BBC are doing, Mike?
Well, this is an interesting little story because apparently, according to RT here, police have used the Terrorism Act to seize the laptop of a BBC journalist who had been working on the Newsnight programme. What seems to have happened is that Newsnight has had somebody on who has claimed to be a member of Islamic State. They've come on as Islamic State's spokesperson, and of course the BBC has been very happy to give them airtime. And so what happened then was that the police, according to the BBC, obtained an order under the Terrorism Act requiring the BBC to hand over communication between a Newsnight journalist and the man in Syria who had been publicly identified as an IS member. And if what they go on to say is that, of course, this wasn't a private source. It wasn't a confidential source. So really, it's okay then. But of course, it's not really okay if the BBC had been asked to hand over communications. Then hand over the communications. You don't necessarily need to hand over the laptop, which may have other confidential information on it as well. Cooperate with the police if there's a court order in place, but why wait for them to come along and steal your hardware and image your hard disk? There's something not quite adding up here.
Well, maybe, Mike, this is actually going to give some of the BBC journalists a jolt that they need to start doing some proper investigative journalism instead of simply reporting the propaganda the state pours out.
Well, speaking of propaganda, this is quite an amazing article in the Times. GCHQ's never-ending search for that needle in the haystack. And it begins, I'm sitting in an upstairs boardroom of GCHQ, the government communications headquarters in Cheltenham, with a tall, thin man of about 35 with extremely sharp eyes. Brian is responsible for... Is that you?
Afraid no, not in this case, no.
Brian is responsible for coordinating the deployment of some of Britain's most secret weapons, those used for intercepting communications abroad and using the results to track terrorists, criminals, and cyber enemies around the globe. So let's have a look and see who they claim these people are. Here is the useful infographic that they provide. Well, of course, we've got Putin on there. We've got North Korea. We've got Iran. We've got some guy that looks like Jihadi John. Is he Syrian? Is he British? What is he? We're not sure. And who's that on the left? Is that one of the
Lee Rigby killers, isn't
killers?
it?
Yeah. So, so there you go. These are the people that they are tracking.
Can I just say, Mike, the thing I find extraordinary about this little collage is that we've got North Korea there on the right, and we've got President Putin, Russia. China has completely disappeared off the map.
Because we're best friends now.
Well, this is confusing because, of course, the Americans still regard China as a very dangerous enemy, which is why they're spending billions of dollars keeping carriers off the Chinese seaboard. But according to David Cameron, that vast communist nation has now become ultra-friendly, going to rebuild our nuclear infrastructure, and GCHQ doesn't need to spy on them at all.
Well, not
is
in
that
this
a cost saving, maybe?
No, not in this infographic. But of course, let's remember the duplicity of the British foreign policy over the decades and centuries. And I think what we've got going on there is we are wooing China. We're making them our friends, and then the common purpose agenda moves in. This is what we were talking about a day or two ago. So this is an attempt to get in from a friendly position, shall we say, I think. But anyway, I see your point. But in the meantime, Andrew Parker, who's the Director General of MI5, has warned of the, quotes, three-dimensional threat faced by us from ISIS. He's talking about mass casualty attacks. So are we being warned about another 7/7 or 9/11 here? Possibly. This was a speech that he gave yesterday evening. And he said, we could not have predicted how the ISIS terrorist phenomenon has developed in 3 years. More than 750 extremists from this country have travelled to Syria, and the growth in the threat shows no sign of abating. In a range of attacks in Europe and elsewhere, this year we have seen greater ambition for mass casualty attacks. All of this underlines the growing threat we face. It may not have reached the high water mark, and despite the successes we have had, we can never be confident in stopping everything. So there's the threat, effectively. So basically, between that speech from Andrew Parker and the report in the Times, we've just got to really accept the surveillance and suck it up, Brian.
Well, I'm not going to accept it at all because we have not seen a scrap of real evidence from our security services, whether that's MI6, MI5 or GCHQ, for the international terrorist threats that we're constantly warned about. And while that is the case, we've also got groups going into schools. I had a conversation with a local councillor a couple of days ago talking about safeguarding briefings for the whole council, in which two ladies from the local police force were warning about the radicalisation of children and how everybody in the local council, whether they were part of the child safeguarding team or they were ordinary councillors, had to be keeping a watchful eye out for these radicalised children. So what was that figure? 750 people travelled from Britain to become radicalised jihadists. Where is the proof for that statement, Mike? Have we actually seen any evidence from the British security services?
I haven't. I've only seen rhetoric in the media.
We'll ask Justin. Justin, have you seen any evidence for this exodus of
none at
terrorists?
all. No, none at all. This whole exercise, I just think of a four-letter word beginning with F. Before you get worried, that word is fear. And this is all about ratcheting up the fear factor. There is some talk from intelligence sources, I say intelligent as opposed to intelligence, who are suggesting there could be another attack, in inverted commas, sometime in November. And if I was a betting man, I would suggest that a dirty nuclear bomb, that's a low-tech, high-tech bomb, to put fear rather than any actual casualties, may happen somewhere. That is, if I had to take a bet, what they're up to. They're certainly ratcheting up the fear, and I think that as the truth comes out about the central banking system and how people can see how few people can control the world, they've got to do something to basically stop people from searching for the truth and to go back into their fear mold, into their fear factor, into their fear thing, so that they stop thinking and they keep reacting to the propaganda that's pushed to them. So I am half expecting something to happen in November.
Okay, well that's very interesting. We'll just put a qualifier in there, the they being the rogue elements of both the British government and the American government, together with their linked intelligence services, with the money from the banks who are ramping this very dangerous rhetoric up. Well, you've mentioned the nuclear industry, as it were, Mike.
Well, of course, this is the radioactive waste management part of that, and if we're talking about deep geological disposal here, as we mentioned yesterday, there was a meeting on this, a public meeting on this in Plymouth on Wednesday night, and we are going to do on Monday a special edition of Fracking Nightmare, because Ian had not intended to be in Plymouth on Monday for Fracking Nightmare, so we do have a special edition at 9 p.m. on Monday night. There'll be no Crane Report on Monday night, but there will be a Fracking Nightmare. And can I just finally remind everybody once again of this event on Sunday, Get Wired 2015. Great lineup of international speakers, including medical doctors, scientists, academics, researchers, and they're presenting the latest on the health risks posed by wireless technologies. This was the event that Mike Mitchum mentioned on Wednesday. So do get along to that if you can. It is in Bolney, and it's not very expensive. I think it's £10 if you're on a student or so on, and £20 for everybody else. So it's not too expensive, and you can get the details at wire.red. It's GETWI.RED. Get Wired with a dot in the middle.
Okay. Well, of course, if David Cameron is really worried about the threat of war, whether that's in the Middle East or within Russia, what he would be doing is protecting Britain's strategic infrastructure, and steel must form a key part of that. But of course, what is happening is the exact opposite, that we're now seeing David Cameron and his team, particularly George Osborne, absolutely destroying the British steel industry. It took the Mirror to come out with this report. Shameless Tories spend millions on Swedish steel while British plants left to rot. And the meat of this story is that basically there's been some huge defence orders put not only for warships but for armoured vehicles. Minimum of about 3.65 billion in the order, the military order itself. What steel are they going to use? Well, they're going to use Swedish steel, not British steel, and therefore they are not supporting British strategic industry. So we just like to remind people of what the Labour, Conservative and Lib Dem governments have done over years. Shipbuilding destroyed, coal industry destroyed, car industry destroyed, farming, rail industry, aviation destroyed, space industry destroyed, munitions industry destroyed, and now they're going for the steel industry. This is not accidental. What we're watching here is a salami slice operation, some of it by stealth, some of it hidden in plain sight. What is the agenda? To destroy Britain's capability as a nation state, not only to defend itself, but to function. And I think you've got some more to say on steel here, Mike.
Well, indeed, I wanted to highlight this opinion piece in The Guardian again. The headline says it all. Why don't we save our steel workers when we've spent billions on bankers? And the point here is, Gordon Brown, according to IMF estimates, bailed the banks out to the tune of 1.2 trillion pounds of public money, which is equivalent to £20,000 for every man, woman and child in the country. So the question being asked here is, why has the government done absolutely nothing for the steel industry? And I mean, your list there, Brian, really sums it up. The answer to that question is because it's policy, and the policy is that to destroy manufacturing in this country. And when you've got a policy like that, it's not just about destruction of manufacturing, it's destruction of the economy as a whole, and the sort of devolution. I don't mean that in the sense of taking power away from a central government, but the de-evolution, if you understand what I'm saying, of society as a whole in this country. And so what we see is this type of thing. TB rates in parts of London worse than Iraq, Eritrea and Rwanda. This is a result of government policy, government health policy, which is the same attitude to healthcare as we have as an attitude to steel or an attitude to every other area of our economy. And where does that end up? It ends up with this article here: steel workers told to find new jobs making sandwiches in latest snub. This isn't a snub to steel workers, because the snub actually over the last 40 years or so has been to every man, woman and child in this country, as we've seen the quality of our work, our jobs and our workforce fall year after year after year, not just under the Conservatives, but under every single criminal government that we've had in this country for the last 40 years. So this is a final realization, it seems, by the Daily Mirror of what we've been talking about for quite a number of months now: the destruction of quality jobs in this country being replaced by coffee serving, shelf stacking, low quality, low paid jobs. This issue with steel is, as important as it is only part of the overall picture of the destruction of the economy of this country.
Well, we're going to mention tax credits in a minute, Mike. But of course, the other thing going on now is a vicious attack on the constitution of this country, and that is the attack on the Lords.
Yes,
and you've picked up on the Guardian again here.
Yeah, another blatant attack on the Lords. And let's face it, the House of Lords has got many questions to answer and deserves many attacks. But the fact of the matter is that the House of Lords has been under attack itself since the 1911 Parliament Act, really. And, the House of Lords is there as one of the checks and balances on the House of Commons. And, all the complaints that have been over tax credits in the last couple of days has been how this undemocratic, unelected chamber, upper house, has gone against the will of the elected lower house. And the elected chamber, of course, is the only thing that we really need. This is all they've got in Scotland. They've only got one chamber. They've got no checks and balances in what they're doing, and that's why they've ended up with the named person scheme. That's why they've ended up with all the other draconian stuff, a single police district and so on in Scotland. There's nobody to question what is going on with the so-called elected representatives in the elected chamber. So this attack, while you might say that the House of Lords is far from perfect, and indeed it is, the House of Lords we got is as a direct result of the interference and the restrictions placed on it by the House of Commons over the last 120 years.
Yeah, and they're going flat out with this one. Justin, we're going to bring you in just very shortly. We thought we'd just cover Mr. Corbyn here because, of course, he's performed quite well over the last couple of days. And this article here from Welfare Weekly is pointing out that David Cameron dodged a simple question from Mr. Corbyn 6 times. And that question was, would anybody suffer as a result of the changes in tax credits? It's a very interesting film clip, so I would encourage people to go to Welfare Weekly when they can have a look at this video clip. We've only just taken a couple of screenshots, but Corbyn just very calmly asking the question, Cameron refusing to answer it, Corbyn asking the question again, sticking to the point in a very professional and calm manner, and then it ended up with this shot of Cameron. Now, the expression on his face, I think, is very interesting. I think there's almost a boiling anger there under the surface, and I think this is a little bit of cognitive dissonance because, of course, David Cameron doesn't have any answers. He can only give the script. He doesn't think for himself. But what an expression on his face, and what an expression on the face of the Chancellor. I've called him the BBC Osborne here because this man has got to be brain dead. The man with immense power in the country. Has he just turned up after another really rough night, having a few beers and a glass of Coke, or however you take that stuff now? It's astonishing, absolutely astonishing. And in the background, Mike, we've got changes now, or possible changes with the Bank of England.
Well, this is another opinion piece, this time from Richard Murphy, who, of course, is the economic expert for the Labour Party at the moment. Now, he's saying Mark Carney admits that Bank of England independence has failed, and so what now? And it's one of a series of articles on the Tax Research UK website really discussing the issue of Bank of England independence. Now, of course, one of the policies that was in the Corbynomics document was this idea of people's quantitative easing, and of course, that's centred around the Bank of England as being the body which issues the money. But Richard Murphy here really arguing that the Bank of England should no longer be independent, that it does not work under the present circumstances. It doesn't really know what it's doing, and there's basically no accountability. So this is really for Justin to comment on, because the issue of the Bank of England is pretty core to the criticism of Corbyn's economic policies.
Right. Okay. Right. Okay. Right. Well, can I just go back a little bit? First of all, just say that obviously with the Bradbury, all our strategic industries could be looked after and nurtured, and that self-reliance would once again come back to this country. Now, getting over to Richard Murphy. Now, he does not want to talk about the Bank for International Settlements. He doesn't want to discuss the greater central banking system and how it works. And this idea that the Bank of England is independent, and well, you and Mike and I both know, is completely laughable. But he refuses point blank. In fact, he nearly ditched me off his website, because I contribute every now and then. And he basically gave me a warning that do not mention the Bradbury again. Do not mention the Bank for International Settlements. We know about it. And he was basically saying, if you carry on and persist in this direction, you won't be allowed to contribute.
Well, sorry, Justin, I'll just interject there, because of course he's not talking about he's talking about independence in the sense of independence from government, not in the sense of independence from the rest of the financial system. And of course, this is the bit that really concerns us: is this lack of independence from the rest of the financial system and the central banking system, and with the BIS at its centre.
That's right, absolutely right. So, but I just find it very disturbing that here is a man who's currently enjoying his 15 minutes of fame, by obviously linking himself with John McDonnell and so forth and Jeremy Corbyn, but he will not look at the bigger picture, and that's what scares me. And that's how you usually know that you're not going to get very far with the concept of the Bradbury pound with people who cannot embrace the much bigger picture. Now, if I may, I'll just tell you what I'm doing at the moment. I wrote an 8-page letter, thoroughly detailed letter, to John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, and it was delivered, and I've got a signature from one of his PAs called Miss Lauder. So I know the letter has been received in John McDonnell's office. I haven't had a written reply yet, because I deliberately want them to send me a snail mail reply. But I've asked for a meeting between our team and John McDonnell's team to discuss what, after all, John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn signed, early day motion 748, in 2013, when they called for the restoration of the Bradbury pound. Now, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we are going to get that meeting, because Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell come across as thoroughly decent people. And I think they are on the side of the poor. They are on the side of the people who are being abused by the system. I'm just keeping my fingers crossed that they will not allow themselves to be sidetracked. Now they are in a position where basically anything they say is reported in the national media. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we are going to get this meeting, and that we can discuss how the Bradbury pound, the concept of debt-free, interest-free money issued by the Treasury based on the wealth of the nation, can be restored to this country. So I'm being optimistic. I'm hoping that we will get this meeting.
Justin, isn't it interesting though that we've got a financial crisis, we've got trouble in the economy. You propose a solution, which is not a new solution. It was a solution that was tried and tested, the Bradbury pound. You don't get welcomed in, come and visit and tell us more. How can we explore this positive way of dealing with problems? You get warned off. I regard that as very significant. We don't want you talking about this because it's too embarrassing. It's heading in the right direction.
I'm going to say this. I can't name a source, but somebody who I talked to about the Bradbury and other things, and he obviously has links with Inside, he did tell me when I showed him the letter, he said, you are putting them between the rock and the hard place. They will not know how to respond. So I don't know what to expect. Jeremy Corbyn is calling for a kinder and gentler politics. Well, I can't think of a kinder and gentler, more politics and economics than bringing in the Bradbury, so the steel workers know they've got a future. All our strategic industries know they have a future. Our youngsters will know that they can be trained properly in skills that will take forward our industries and to make the country industrious and happy. I mean, everywhere you look, the Bradbury is just nothing but good news. So as you say, Brian, why are we not being welcomed with open arms? And, I do find it rather alarming to be told by somebody I trust that you've put Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell between the rock and the hard place. We know that this is the Achilles heel of the whole central banking system. Once people wake up to the simple fact, in fact, a very good friend of mine just simply said, you sum it up in one sentence, no sovereign nation needs to borrow. No sovereign nation needs to borrow. And he's been at this for over 50 years, trying to persuade governments to realize this. So, I believe we're going towards the end of the road. The truth is bursting to get out. And as I said in one of my pieces now, the truth is hammering on the door, demanding to be let in. Have you got the courage to unlock the door? And that is the challenge now to all our decision makers, our elected representatives, because the truth is there. It's simple to understand. If I can understand it, anybody can understand it.
Yeah. Right. Thank you for that, Justin. And one of the reasons we need to get a move on with matters to do with money in the economy is perhaps this.
Indeed, because this is China saying it. So this is the the Director General of the China Banking Regulatory Commission, Min Lau, and he says exactly what you can see there. It's likely the world will face another global financial crisis in the next 5 years. The reason lies in the fact that many of the problems behind the 2008 crisis remain unsolved. The fragility is still there. For instance, the shadow banking, high indebtedness, a lack of structural reform, the sustainability of emerging markets, and high leverage. This is something that we've been reiterating time and time again. Nothing has changed since 2008, other than the debt that's being carried by us all is worse than it was then. The corruption is worse than it was then. The money laundering is worse than it was then. And none of the structural reforms, like a proper banking separation between commercial and investment banks, none of that has been done. Even the ring fence is being watered down in front of our very eyes. And so this guy is absolutely hitting the nail on the head. Now, whether within the next 5 years is accurate or not remains to be seen. But it is an inevitable situation. Nothing is going to change that until there are some significant political changes which break up the banks and stop the corruption.
Okay, thanks for that, Mike. Well, of course, we can say that one of the big failings in Britain today is the failure of Britain's police forces to actually investigate the crime and corruption taking place in the banking industry. But they're not unique in failing to investigate banks because it's now coming to the surface that as police forces withdraw due to these fraudulent austerity measures, what is happening is crime is on the increase. And an Essex village here is another one saying it's going to hire its own security service after the residents' Tiptree in Essex here. There's been a 250% rise in burglaries over the past 12 months because there's no police on the streets. But let's bring in this lady again, Sarah Thornton. She was the former boss of Thames Valley Police. She's now chairman of the Police Chiefs Council on a mere £250,000 a year. She says that police patrols do not help to cut crime or make people feel safer. So we're going to say interesting. We've got a common purpose leader. Remember that this is a highly trained common purpose lady. Failed to investigate child abuse crimes in Thames Valley and clearly her common sense has now been skewed, because she says, well, police do not make a difference, when the local residents are clearly saying, well, the absence of police is making a big difference. So we've had the political charity Common Purpose select Sarah Thornton as a world future leader in order to advise us that we don't need police to make us safe. Reframed is the word. This woman is not thinking in the way any normal person would. And the police failing in Nottingham. The Chad here reporting that there's been an arrest and charges against a 68-year-old. This is in relation to abuse at children's homes around Mansfield and Ashfield. A 68-year-old man facing 7 allegations of sexual offences, including rape and indecent assault of girls dating back to between 1982 and 1987. We're going to contrast that with the comments from David Hollis, who's the man leading the Nottingham Child Sex Abuse Action Group. And he said that one of the biggest concerns is that Operation Daybreak has been going on for 5 years, and to our knowledge, there's only been 1 prosecution. Now with the Xeris, the numbers come up to 2, but with a number of victims that have come forward, he's saying essentially we would expect more, and I think the reality is many more. So what's been going on with Nottingham Police and child abuse? Well, let's have a look at this little flow chart around child abuse investigations. And we'll bring in, first of all, Operation Daybreak. This started in 2010 after Melanie Shaw whistle blew on her own abuse and that of other children at Beechwood Home in Nottingham. It expanded to cover all of these homes: Beechwood, Bracken, Thames, in Bulwell, Runskill, Bestwood, Wood Nook, Beechdale Road, Risley Hall. Hundreds of survivors, possibly thousands, hundreds of survivors as a result of the investigations across those homes, but also including statements of murder, which Melanie Shaw made. She maintains that children were murdered at Beechwood Home. What happens to her? Well, 5 years later, there's only 1 prosecution, but Melanie Shaw has been secretly arrested, threatened, harassed by Nottingham Police, imprisoned, and her child taken away from her. But there's more, because Nottingham Police failed to take Melanie Shaw to the Beechwood site. There was no proper forensic examination of the site. The site was rapidly sold by Notts Council for demolition and redevelopment. Witnesses who did return to that Beechwood site with Melanie Shaw saw documents and children's records on site. They were later removed by people unknown, those records. But witnesses were then subsequently threatened in Nottinghamshire Police Station. Senior Notts Police media officials also threatened public who were investigating the abuses. And Nottingham Police attempted to charge the UK column with the offence of revealing an abuse victim's name, Melanie Shaw. But of course, Melanie had contacted us specifically to request that we publicised her case, her name and her identity. And we'll just remind viewers that, of course, when we approached Justice Goddard for the CSA inquiry to ask what help she was going to give to protect Melanie Shaw and other abuse whistleblowers from institutional harassment and threats, she said none. So here's the new investigation, Xeris, investigating abuse in homes outside Nottingham. I'm just going to say, notice the date. The police can't pick up paedophiles working at present, but they can investigate who was abusing who back into the 1940s. Quite remarkable policing. I think this is deliberate. A whole range of new children's homes where the police are saying there's at least 300 survivors. Now let's remember what we're saying here. A survivor is a person who has survived abuse, at least 300 children abused. Another set alongside the hundreds in the Operation Daybreak. And what have we got? 1 prosecution coming out of the police. So I think it's quite clear that we've got a massive cover-up of child abuse by Nottingham Police And of course, what are police officers telling us? They are telling us exactly the same thing that Met Police are telling us, and that is the cover-up is to protect the names of high-profile establishment and political figures. If you think that is bad, have a look at what is being reported on Alice Through the Looking Glass website. Yet another report of police failing to investigate paedophiles and then attacking those making the report. This story, which we know a little bit about ourselves, quite remarkable. A man is approached by a member of the establishment who casually says, "I will give you £25,000 if I can abuse your son." When the father, of course, said, "Go away," the man said, "Well, you want to be very careful about this because if you say anything, you'll be in trouble with the police and social services." So the father did say something, and as is reported here, not only did police officers not investigate the paedophile, they sent a litigious report to social services about the family, and ultimately, when the family ran to Ireland, the children were then taken away from the parents by police and placed in foster homes. So a paedophile approaches a family, offers literally to buy a child for abuse, and what do the police do? They protect the high-profile paedophile. Well, let's remember this Operation Planet and the UK column report on Eilish Angelini. Back in 1991, she prepared a report for the Crown Office up in Scotland that sought to establish rationale for and the extent to which the protections offered by common law could be circumvented and statute law ignored in order basically to allow men to interfere with boys. So this was the lady in charge of legal affairs in Scotland, and of course the same lady who has pretty heavily pursued Robert Greene for trying to expose the abuse of children. And we'll just bring in this one. This is actually from David Icke's website, a video clip in which Piers Morgan is interviewing Johnny Rotten. And what Johnny Rotten is saying in that video clip is that the BBC banned him once he started to speak out about Jimmy Savile. So our question is, what is Piers Morgan going to do about this? Very good at interviewing. What is Piers Morgan going to do about the information he now holds? Justin, we're very short for time. Any comments on the unpleasant topic of child abuse?
I would just say that I don't know if you've heard the news today, but the Chilcot inquiry is due to be completed next July or something. How long has that taken? 6, 7 years? This child abuse inquiry is destined for 10 years. Everywhere you look, you can see the establishment blurring things, muddying things, and basically delaying things. And you know, it's very sad. But unless people wake up and demand a much shorter and sharper, inquiry, this whole thing is just going to limp on, and the victims are not going to get any sort of justice at all. I find it very sad, but the truth is, people are waking up, and with programs like this, like UK Column and elsewhere, I think people are going to get a voice very quickly, and the wrongdoers are going to be really on the back foot. So let's keep at it.
Okay, thank you for that. And I'll just add, of course, if you are a policeman or woman, it's your responsibility to investigate crime. Failure to investigate crime is a criminal act itself. That's the hard part of the story. The other part is that the state will ultimately come for the children of policemen and women, just as it has for other members of society. So if you are involved with Britain's police, or you know somebody who is, it's time for them to start doing their job and investigating and apprehending criminals. I'll just add to that we understand that there's quite a rift developing between Theresa May, Home Secretary, and Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe, the Chief Constable of the Met Police. We haven't got full details of what the spat is about, but apparently there's a venomous rift developing between these two. And it's been indicated to us that possibly this is to do with the fear factor over the truth, as you say, Justin, that is coming to the surface about the abuse of children by members of Britain's political establishment and VIP establishment, as it's called. So we'll wait and see where that leads us. Justin, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to all our viewers and listeners. And I'll also say a big thank you to the small Bournemouth delegation who drove all the way to Plymouth yesterday evening in order to have an enjoyable evening with us and discuss a little bit of business round the table. So thank you very much for coming. It was much appreciated. We'll be back same time tomorrow with, of course, David Scott from Northern Exposure. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.